Ceru, ka esat visi atpakaļ un sāksim nākamo semināra daļu, kurā jau vairāk fokusēsimies nevis uz kaut kāda veida konkrētiem datiem, datu tipiem un to priekšrocību un varbūt kādu robu analīzi un pārdomām. Dosimies tālāk jau pie metodoloģijas. Mūsu redzeslokā šodien vēl viens ESPON projekts, QGSSP, un par to mums noziņos, kā jau minēju semināru sākumā, no citas Igaunijas universitātes, no Tallinas tehnoloģiju universitātes. Un šoreiz tā vienkārši ir sagadījies, ka šīs tēmas tiešām mūsu kaimiņi apskata ļoti padziļināti un arī iesaistās ar tām saistītos projektos ESPON. Bet tad brīdinu, ka tagad pārslēgšos arī uz angļu valodu. Cerams, ka esat visi tam gatavi. Un jau atkal runātājs runās aptuveni pusstundu kā iepriekšēji, un tad mums būs laiciņš jautājumiem, ja nu tādi rodās. Pārslēdzos uz angļu valodu. All right, so we will start now again in English. Thank you so much for joining us, Kimo. So I will give you the floor. Please introduce yourself a little bit and, of course, then continue on with the project. But just to recap before we start, in the first part, we more viewed the sort of opposition, not even opposition, the complementarity of big data and small data, of course, from the perspective of Estonian mobility data that we have seen a lot about in the ESPON Big Data project, and then from the perspective of the coastal visitation assessment and infrastructure and vegetation quality assessment done here in Latvia. And we also looked at what benefits we could derive from big data for this assessment, because mostly it has been our dear colleague Andris Klepers walking the coast, doing a lot of field work. It is extensive both in hours and the amount of data that has to be collected. So now we will turn to the approaches of quantifying something that is usually quite difficult to quantify. So greenhouse gas emissions, and for planners, this is important. Of course, we all know about the principles of greenhouse gases and how global climate change is being impacted by it, but I think it is very important and useful to give a tangible kind of sense to it, understanding. So please, the floor is yours. Kimo.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be part of this seminar, and I was following the presentations, although, of course, the Latvian presentations were a bit difficult for me. But yes, a brief introduction. I'm Finnish architect, calling from Helsinki, actually. Have been working at Aalto University, Helsinki, for 9 years, 2 years in Sweden, and now is my 7th year in Tallinn University of Technology, where I'm a professor of architecture and head of the Academy of Architecture and Urban Studies. Greenhouse gas quantification has been kind of favorite research topic for me and my team. So I will very briefly tell some sentences about other activities in this field too in my presentation. So let me start by sharing the screen. Right. So you should see now my title, the ESPON QGSSP project. Hope you do.
Yes.
Thank you. So I will briefly take you through the project, the outcomes, and the difficulties we faced during the project. And we've actually continued on this topic also after the project ended. So I will give you a very brief overview of the findings after the completion of the project. So firstly, the project here was an ESPON project where there were 4 stakeholders, and the objective was very clearly stated. They were asking for a methodology and a tool that could be used across Europe, and which would work as a planning support tool, advising the planners about the climate impacts of their plans. And it was also supposed to help with the collection of comparable baseline emissions data at national, regional, and local levels which we now call spatial subnational scale. So we are in smaller scale than national scale, and we are excluding companies' greenhouse gas emissions, but any size, region, town, district, part of the city could be assessed with the same method and the tool. And the comparability was the key of this assignment, originating from Ireland. And I will get back to the SARE process also later. The 4 countries that were included in the project from ESPON side were actually 2 areas from the UK, and then 1 authority from Ireland, and then 1 from Finland. And our team that got the project after the tendering procedure was consisted of Estonian and Irish researchers. Stockholm Environment Institute was the Tallinn center, so it consisted of Estonia-based researchers, although we were quite international team at the end. And during the process also, Professor Jukka Heinonen from the University of Iceland joined the team to help us out with the methodological questions. Why this was difficult? You might think that, cities are doing this all the time and now we need the tool, so why don't you just make a tool and there we go. It's more complicated than that. The background is that the greenhouse gas emissions method, quantification method for cities and regions is one of the domains which is not harmonized yet. And this is something that has been pointed out in several journal articles, that comparisons are impossible or not justified, to be exact. And the cities' methods and the quality of the data applied in cities' greenhouse gas inventories, there's a lot of variation in it. And the kind of research background to it is that we can allocate the emissions in different ways. And as the quote here says, it is very difficult to point out which allocation principle would be justified. We are basically talking about who's to blame for the emissions. Is it the end user of a product, or is it the factory that produces the product? If my laptop is produced in China, should be counted in the city's emissions in China, where the factory is located, or are they my emissions as end user? And should they be then allocated to according to my hometown, Helsinki, or where I work, or what is the principle here? And this is one of the key issues causing differences between the inventories of cities. And if we look at the scientific literature, we can identify 5 different approaches here pointed out by different researchers. And the key finding as proposed here by Professor Anu Ramaswamy is that a combination of 2 approaches seems to be the most informative at the moment. And this is what we call now the dual greenhouse gas accounting approach. You might not find this term in not too many documents because we picked it up from Anu Ramaswamy's journal article, but this kind of combination of 2 approaches is mentioned in many standards and documents, also by C40 cities that have noticed that if we do one assessment only, we get very biased understanding of the city's emissions. So proceeding with this idea of the dual accounting approach, we combine 2 approaches under one tool, territorial approach and a consumption-based approach. Territorial referring to an approach where we start with the physical boundaries of the area under assessment, and we start assessing the direct emissions inside those boundaries. And according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidelines, this is then later extended towards Scope 2 and Scope 3 that actually change this allocation principle a bit. But yet this approach is called territorial approach as it starts with the administrative boundaries of a city or a region. And then consumption-based approach also uses the administrative boundary, but it looks at the consumption of the residents inside the area and allocates the emissions for the end user. And the results from these 2 different approaches differ a lot, as also pointed out by the network of C40 cities. To demonstrate this difference for you, I made the two examples. This is the same territorial approach, is the same approach that we use in national reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, where it seems to work quite fine. We are reporting the emissions caused inside the national boundaries, in this case Estonia, so we take the boundaries of the country. And for example, my case here is for transportation. We look at the transportation, passenger transport happening inside the area. Here I'm driving from Tallinn towards Latvia. I make my visit over there and go back. And my driving inside the boundaries of Estonia are reported as Estonia's emissions. Then there are tourists coming from Central Europe. They drive through Estonia and continue their trip towards Helsinki or Finland. And also their driving inside the boundaries of Estonia are included in the emissions for transportation. And what causes confusion here is that we report them per capita, and you easily get an impression that the number we get in the end would reflect the mobility of an Estonian citizen. But it doesn't, because it includes the random tourists and only one part of my trips as an Estonian. So it is actually also a bit confusing, even in country scale, to report the transportation emissions on a territorial basis. And this is even more emphasized when we go towards the smaller scale. Actually, the scientific literature points out that the smaller the area is, the more we have emissions that actually occur outside these boundaries, and the more biased the result actually is. It basically misses so-called carbon leakage, the production outside the boundaries of the assessment area, and in this way doesn't very well reflect the climate impact of our daily lives. This is one of the stakeholders in QGAS-SP project, the Kymenlaakso region, that consists of 6 municipalities, and we were assessing their emissions. For example, the same example of transportation. All the transportation taking place inside the boundaries is included, but Kymenlaakso happens to have also this kind of highways that just go through the area, serving the whole country as a main artery for road transportation in Finland, and major harbors, bringing in a lot of goods and services that are not only for Kymenlaakso. And we kind of punish the Kymenlaakso in territorial assessment for these services that are not only for the residents of Kymenlaakso. And for this reason, we kind of acknowledge that the territorial approach typically applied for cities and territories is a bit biased and gives us results that cannot recognize all the emissions associated with our activities. And therefore, this dual accounting approach is needed. Other problems detected here, if you want to kind of understand our emissions and then reflect to them by means of spatial planning, there is terminological confusion. We have 2 approaches on emissions. Most widely applied is the territorial approach, and now the complementary perspective that we want to include is called consumption-based approach. But in many documents you actually see them referring to scope 1 as territorial emissions and scope 3 as consumption-based emissions, which is very confusing for someone who cannot tell by the context what this is about. And more than that, you probably also are conducting SECAP studies in Latvia. Most Estonian towns and cities do this kind of sustainable energy and climate action plans, which includes greenhouse gas inventories, the baseline inventories for cities. And they are instructed by the Covenant of Mayors guidelines, and most of them only include scopes 1 and 2 that are relatively easy to report. But when we look at the spatial planning, a typical case in spatial planning is about investing materials to gain savings in energy. For example, if we build up a new tram line, we are investing tramline materials, steel, different kind of gravel and maybe asphalt to build it up. And we get gains in, savings in transport emissions. But now most of the cities do not have scope 3. So when we try to assess the impacts of renovation or this new tram line, we are missing all the material related emissions, and we only see the gains in the inventory. So as a support system for spatial planning, this kind of most typical city inventory, greenhouse gas inventory, is not very useful at all because it measures these so-called embodied emissions. So we only see the benefits if we assess a certain impact, but do not see the cost for the environment. So these kind of difficulties we were trying to deal with when suggesting this method, and we also kind of realized that this is kind of rather monumental assignment to propose something for the whole Europe, knowing that the standards or harmonization is not in place. But we wanted to make a try. Also, the planning systems across Europe, as you know, differ from each other very much. This is one study kind of suggesting that the planning systems could be placed under 5 categories. Probably nowadays, this is not a very good description of the variation in the planning systems. There's also a recent ESPON study about that, which gives us a more detailed picture. But this is just to show that if one system is to serve all these different planning systems, it has to be rather generic and flexible. What we have in common is the strategic environmental assessment process that doesn't usually include this kind of greenhouse gas assessment, but in my opinion, it definitely should. And we made some observations how we could take this kind of greenhouse gas assessment process systematically under SEA. And we described in our report how it could kind of land to this existing framework of strategic environmental assessment in most simplest format to show that there are no climate impacts to quantify. Okay, so to sum up the difficulties, methodological difficulties in this domain, I would put it in a nutshell like this. The methods of subnational greenhouse gas assessment are changing all the time. They are still under development. They are not established and solid that you would just be able to put in a tool. And they were originally developing so that the inventories were aligned with the national inventories. And this is not very beneficial for the impact assessment. And in the impact assessment, we are kind of leaning towards carbon footprint assessment of construction works, which is also methodology under development. And as we know, will be mandatory, required by the EPBD directive very soon. And these two approaches are not perfectly compatible. So we also have to struggle with this kind of difficulty. And at this point, I would maybe even question whether it was wise to align with the national inventories to begin with, because what we would need is a rapid, impactful, and cost-efficient climate action. And for that, we need more impact assessment than monitoring and reporting practice that aligns with the national inventories. Okay, but I hope that this kind of opened up the difficulties that we recognized in the methodological side, and yet we had to produce a tool. At the same time, in relation to the topic of today's seminar, I want to also highlight that there are these kind of technology enablers on the way that may come to help with this kind of difficult situation, where we basically would need to do 2 inventories to understand the emissions of a city. And that's a lot of work, of course. Very few cities actually do 2 inventories, and very few cities include the scope 3 with the material emissions in their work. But in our work after the QGAS-SP project, we've been also looking into what is happening in urban digital twins and national digital twins worldwide. Where are the most advanced and sophisticated applications to quantify the greenhouse gas emissions using the existing data infrastructure that we call urban digital twins? And we've detected some cutting-edge applications like the GHG app in Singapore, or in Ireland, there's a very advanced study in the town of Limerick, or in Gothenburg, Sweden. They are adding this embodied emissions aspect into the local urban digital twin. So it's emerging, but it's not there yet to help us. The digital twin brings in the scenario process as well the machine learning aspect. One thing that we learned during the QGAS-SP project was that there is no harmonized basis for future scenarios. So in each city, in each territory, we built up the future scenarios using different kind of assumptions. And this is another feature that brings incoherence between the greenhouse gas assessment reporting and plans between the cities. In Urban Digital Twins, as you may know, we are modeling a process of the city. It doesn't necessarily mean a 3D model. It could be just a digital model of transportation or energy use in buildings or any aspect in the city. But we are kind of tapping into the reality with the sensor data, and we are frequently updating the digital model so that it is up to date. And for some processes, this frequency of updating can be 1 year. For some processes, it is beneficial to have it in real time. And the great benefit here is that we actually do not only have then two counterparts working together, the real city and its virtual counterpart, but we have a third entity, the speculative city, where we can test different future scenarios, including the scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, then what we achieved during this project we had. The challenges identified that I tried to describe here, we tried to address all of them. We were not just happy to produce a tool for territorial greenhouse gas assessment that is the typical approach, but we wanted to recognize that you need actually these two perspectives to fully understand the greenhouse gas emission patterns within the assessment area. But there's a lot of variation, and we also acknowledge that most likely the cities that have been doing this for years are not very eager or willing to abandon their monitoring practice if somebody suggests a new method. So this is another obstacle to be conquered for comparability. And this lack of comparability is actually embedded in this territorial approach. So on that side, we will never get results that could be compared. To give you a simple example, if a factory is located inside the city boundary, its emissions are included in territorial assessment. But in many cases, it happens that the factory is just outside the city border, still serving the city, but it's outside the administrative border, and we exclude it. Now, this inclusion or exclusion is pretty much a random thing if you compare the cities, and for this reason, the comparability will be always very weak in territorial. While on consumption-based approach side, the second tool that we are proposing, you can directly compare the results. One challenge that we noticed also is that all the cities, when they conduct their greenhouse gas inventories, and cities, not only cities, but also rural municipalities, territories, they are not using Eurostat data. They are not using any European database. They are using their own local data, which is always more accurate than any European database. And at first we were thinking of working on this kind of NUTS regional data that you probably know. It provides rather accurate data per subnational regions in Europe, but we soon found out that nowadays it is not only administrative entities that want to do greenhouse gas assessment, it is also parts of the cities, islands, areas that are not included in NUTS classification. So a viable method cannot be based on this kind of top-down data. It has to enable the use of bottom-up data collection from the cities directly. So how we tried to address this question in our project was that we included two calculators in one tool, territorial and consumption-based calculations, which are two separate calculation engines. And the latter one enables comparisons, as was our assignment. We made it modular so that if you want to add more components of calculations, like the embodied emissions that have become so important and a topic of a discussion recently, this could be added to the tool structure. And we made it an open source tool, so the code can be accessed in GitHub and used by anyone who wants to use the tool. And then we created the functionality called local dataset. So if you'd like to do that for the city of Riga, you can upload Riga local data into it and conduct the calculations. And what we would like to have with the tool looks like this. We would like to have baseline study. The first year of calculation, we would like to have the baseline scenario what will happen if we don't do anything. And then we would like to have the emission scenario with the policy impact. So when we start applying our climate policies, what is the expected impact over time? And this time perspective is important for spatial planning because, as you know, when we start preparing a plan, we know that the impacts will spread over decades. The impacts will have a long time perspective, and we cannot just project these impacts over 1 year. We had to find the ways how we kind of land this impact assessment kind of operates with this time perspective and lands over the several years when the new area, for example, will be developed. And in a good tool, we would also include the impact of the natural environment, which is rather difficult to quantify, and yet we would like to do it in the same way in all European areas and countries. So we'd had to find a simple way of including the kind of positive climate impact, which usually in these diagrams looks like a negative number, but it's actually the carbon sequestration by the forest land and natural environments in cities. So this is a browser-based tool available all the time, open source. You can copy the code if you want by forking it in GitHub. For those who are into software development, you can go and get the copy of the code if you want. That's the contemporary way of doing tools. And you can create this baseline future projection of the emissions with and without the climate action you plan to have in the tool. And two modes look like this. In territorial mode, we have the key emission sources for land use change, end use in buildings, transport, and placeholder for some other modules that would be necessary, but were not within reach in this time frame. And then we have a consumption-based tool side where you can do this complementary study. And very briefly about users that we expect to use it. A planner user was the basic user of the tool, and we kind of assume that the planner user doesn't have a specific knowledge about methods or greenhouse gas quantification. So we kind of, our assumption was that you have to be able to use the tool inserting only numbers from your own city or area that you know very well. But then we also prepared for expert users, and he or she is the one who can create this kind of local dataset, Riga dataset, Tallinn dataset, or a dataset for any area you can imagine. But you of course then need to know what kind of data you need and where to source it. Then for the developer user who would be software developer, we provide also access to the tool and how to improve it. Right, and this is how it works. So the planner user here can access the tool and create the baseline, and expert user can create the local datasets for different cities and regions. This is how it looks like. There's an instruction video available on the first site of the tool. Unfortunately, we don't have a graphic interface. It would be great to operate on a map or 3D realm, but this was something that we couldn't achieve in this project. And basically you have to fill in hectares and numbers that you as a planner know about your target area first to set up the baseline emissions, to understand the emissions of your area, and then project the impact assessment on top of that. Very briefly then, how did we try to solve these difficulties that the same tool should work in Spain and Estonia, in Latvia and Scotland? So this is how the models work. We have passenger transport and some cargo transport included in here. And the common ground for future projections is this EU reference scenario. In our case, we were using the 2015 model, but there are updates on that already available there. But this was a document that provided the common ground for future projections in all European countries and territories. But of course, they are not territory specific, they are country specific. So for a more detailed projection, future projection in Riga, for example, you would need to have Riga figures and not Latvian figures. For land use change, this was the difficult part about impact of the forest land, and forest land may be changing to other types of land use, we were using the simplest IPCC method, so-called Tier 1 method, that relies on the national inventory reports that are publicly available, and the CRF tables where you can source kind of emission factors for 6 land use types and related carbon pools. So if you calculate with the tool and your forest land is decreasing, the calculation is based on what Latvia was reporting in the national inventory report as an impact for the same land use change on a national level. One difficulty we faced is that there is no common European database that would already allocate all land use over these 6 land use types that we use in national inventory reports. So you have to do it yourself. And for our 4 case studies, we were using the Korean land cover tool, the database, and European soil database that we combined to understand the current land use. And on that, we would then be able to calculate the possible impacts if you change the land use. And for buildings, we took a European common database called EU Buildings Database. And again, the reference scenario projected the future expectations or assumptions considering the future projection, and consumption-based approach relies on XEO base. And here we are using so-called extended environmental input-output approach, basically based on household budget surveys that where we convert the monetary expenditure into emissions. And this way we get the holistic picture of the local households consumption, and that's the respective climate impact of this consumption globally. We did 4 pilot case studies to prove our concept, and these results are also published in this Land Journal article that we wrote. And the 4 case studies were from Finland, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and they were representing different kind of cases. Some of them were big cities, territories, suburban environments, and very peripheric rural environments. And here are the results. I will very briefly take you through the results to show what kind of difficulties we have in this domain. You see that the building emissions for Rathlin Island, very small island with very few, small population living with very limited services in the peripheric area seem to be very high, whereas in big city of Edinburgh, one of the forerunners in climate action, seems to be rather reasonable. Then in transport, Edinburgh emissions look very high, and now you have to pay attention. This is the territorial approach that we typically use, so there's a lot of transportation within the boundaries of Edinburgh. We basically know that, but there are other people driving around than just the residents of Edinburgh. And Rathlin, that is a peripheric area with no trespassing transportation at all, the transport emissions look fantastic. And the impact of land use on Rathlin Island, they are brilliant. Per capita carbon sequestration, the positive impact of climate looks fantastic because most of the island is greenery and there's very small population living on this island. Then when we started comparing the results for energy use in buildings, they look very similar because from household consumption perspective and territorial perspective, they are pretty much the same. But for all the other categories, the difference is rather big, and this is where the benefit of the 2 approaches comes evident. If we look at the conventional territorial analysis for the 4 case studies, here we see that the net emissions for Rathlin Island would actually be already negative, meaning that Rathlin Island is already carbon neutral using the territorial assessment. But when we take the consumption perspective, we notice that life on Rathlin Island causes a lot of emissions outside the island. When they drive for services or go for the hospital or shops, they have to drive a lot, but it takes place outside the boundaries of Rathlin Island. And in reality, the life on Rathlin Island causes quite a lot of emissions. And the most common territorial approach just tends to hide them. And the net emission figure really can be misleading because the real emissions, the global impact of of the residents of Rathlin Island are actually rather high. And now the best practice of the day for planners and for cities to analyze their emissions would be actually to do both of these assessments, territorial and consumption-based, where consumption-based reflects the global impact of local consumption, and the territorial focuses on what happens inside the boundaries of your assessment area. And interpretation is, of course, something that you will need to do to understand why 1 meter shows good result and another one much worse. But hopefully I managed to explain why the results differ from each other. And this is really what is today considered as the best practice for assessing the city's greenhouse gas emissions. And what we were able to do was to kind of highlight the problematics and highlight the need for harmonization. And we were able to convert the best practice into a tool, and we were able to name it. But of course, someone else would need to do the standards that would harmonize this domain a bit. And yeah, what would be the benefit if we would do it in the same way across the Europe? The benefit would be comparison, because now all the territories and cities that just have to throw out their own climate action plans, and they cannot directly learn from each other. But if we would all use the same method, we would see which policies were actually powerful in other contexts similar to ours, and we would be able to learn about that and implement that in our own town or city. Now that's very difficult to do when there's such a big lack of coherence between the subnational inventories. We do hope that this will improve one day. But since this project, we continued our work, and in the Estonian context, we are publishing our free tools and reports on the website ghg.ee. And based on the QGAS SP project, there are still 3 journal articles underway. The first one here is titled Dream of a European Method, that basically addresses the questions that I described in here. What are the reasons behind this kind of differentiation or variation in cities' greenhouse gas inventories, and how they could be maybe harmonized, and what would be the benefits of harmonizing those. Then there's another article about how the frontrunner cities are using their urban digital twins in greenhouse gas quantification, and we also try to illustrate the potential of this technology platform for the purpose. And then the third article is how these embodied emissions, material-related emissions, could be included in cities' greenhouse gas inventories, and what kind of methodological difficulties we see if we start implementing the results of building LCA-based carbon footprint assessments in city scale. They are not directly compatible, and our article tries to highlight the difficulties between the two methodological frameworks. And our results can be viewed at ESPON website. So this link is directly to our tool that you are free to test. And I hope that there will be a continuation project in which we could make the tool even better and maybe have more graphic interface and at least map-based interface, where map as a plan could be utilized for greenhouse gas assessment. I've been very happy to see that there starts to be commercial tools that also apply this dual accounting approach. I know that Stockholm Environment Institute in Sweden is developing this kind of dashboard for communities, meaning municipalities, territories, and cities, where you can have the two perspectives on local emissions. And recently, a Finnish tool was developed by a local consultancy called Sitowise that also has the two perspectives on the emissions. So little by little, we start having tools that commercial tools that use the best practice and are more informative on cities' emissions. And I find this important because otherwise the climate impact is basically steered by a compass that is biased, or you could even say broken, because the picture that it gives us on the city's emissions is really not full picture. It is seriously biased on one direction, and maybe punishing the cities that have a lot of production inside their boundaries and showing too good results for the cities that have outsourced all the industrial production. Okay, this was all from my side. I hope you found it interesting, and I'd be happy to answer to your questions.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. Actually, the way you explained it really shows that the two approaches are inseparable. After this presentation, I cannot perceive a way where one of the listeners would go into the tool and just do one, just for the heck of it. I think it just really demonstrated how the two sides really show a full picture only together. I did have one question. Well, we don't have any questions. We only have a comment, though, in the comments section from Anette about, or maybe Anette, do you want to say it out loud?
Yes, it's not the same thing, but I was participating in this informative inventory report in 2021 when I did for air pollution. I was doing the gridding, and that thing when I just like when I watched how you like build your information and data so it's actually true, and it came to my mind how it was for us that we had to make so many assumptions. And then, for example, we have some assumptions regarding land use, but then again, we still have a lot of data gaps for GIS data, because our land use data is not wholly structured in Latvia. It's like we are kind of working towards that, but the data is still missing. And when I listen to you, I think that it would be so good that we should at least have like one way of assumptions, because I have my assumptions, you in Finland have this assumption, but in the end, again, we can't compare them. But it's actually a common space, like regarding, of course, the Inspire directive that we go cross-border and we should go that everything fits in together, but it's not. Just, yeah, thank you for the inspiration. Yeah.
Thank you. This was, I totally agree that I would say that methods developed so far and tools are very much national, so they are limited by the national borders, and mainly they are built around the data that is available. So if you look at the Finnish tools or Swedish tools or Scottish tools, they first look what's the data that we have available, and then they convert that into the tool. And that's why also the tools differ from each other, and very few tools can actually cross the border and be used in another country. This is what we try to avoid, but I have to be also honest that the tool is far from perfect. I can imagine that user experience could be much better, and for a planner, the opportunity to operate on map base or GIS base would be, of course, fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree. This is something that I'm personally very interested in, seeing how everything goes down to just very, very local scale. But of course, it makes it all the more complicated. You mentioned some potential improvements if there was a continuation of the project or a continuation of improving the tool. I was wondering, in the context of the nature restoration law, we've seen a lot of discussions that it is quite difficult when we talk about urban greening, for example. So here it would come into greenhouse gas sequestration. Then a lot of the new novel solutions account for a big change towards more greenery on the account of vertical greening and greening building roofs. So how do you think that could be incorporated? Because there's a lot of division between vegetation and then buildings. So is there a chance to do that?
That's a very good question, and one of the weak points of the current methodologies we have. For example, the tier 1 method that we finally applied in the tool, because of its easy applicability across the Europe, it is rather blind towards green-blue infrastructure in cities. You imagine places in Riga where you have a lot of greeneries. And basically the allocation is to settlement category under the 6 categories. You just place it under settlements. And this category doesn't recognize the difference between very green urban area and totally asphalt covered greenless area. So this method is not able to tell the difference, but there are new methods emerging. And for example, a project called Co-Carbon is developing LCA-based methods that can go down to a plant level to assess the climate impact of a single tree in a city. And then when they were testing this for the city of Helsinki, they were able to show much higher carbon sequestrations of urban greenery than reported in the city's own inventory. So these methods are emerging, but they are not in common use. In our case study, Edinburgh showed that we got better result for Edinburgh using our method. And mainly the difference was because we were allocating the land inside the Edinburgh city in the different ways to the 6 categories, but also we were actually using a higher resolution, and we were using a data set that has this urban street canopy layer in it. And that was causing better results. And for cities, I see this as an incentive to go towards better calculation as soon as possible, because if they have made the climate commitment to be carbon neutral one day, and they are underestimating the impact of greenery, this means a higher cost for nothing. But if they can provide a realistic assessment of carbon sequestration in their urban greenery, they do not only see the value of maintaining that and improving that, but they also save a lot of money when they do not have to pay for offsets. So this is a very, very important topic. And in one of our projects, we were also developing this kind of algorithmic plant life modeling in digital twins. So also in these city models, we can bring in models of plants that grow according to the algorithms written in them. And we can make future projections. So if we plant a tree now, what its climate impact will be over time. And also we can visualize for the citizens that if we plant the trees now, in 10 years, it will look like that, 20 years, even better, and so on. So also this kind of technical capabilities of proving the value of urban green are gradually improving.
Thank you. Were you talking about the Green Twins project? Because I know
Yes.
they did this dynamic. Okay.
Yes.
Because I've seen some of their proof of concept, and it's so elaborate, just seeing just how much it takes to calculate how a tree will grow. And I think also for our sort of northern conditions, this is also quite complicated. It varies by climate zone and so on. This is very advanced. And I really hope that, I think you are right, that with the new pressures coming on, like the offset costs, and also I think the nature restoration law, of course, there's a big commitment to green more and more. So one advice that they gave us for the nature restoration law implementation is that the more granular the data you have is, the better it will be for you. And for us, this is a lot, of course, to commit to when we think about we will soon have to produce our baseline and we'll soon have to show some improvement. But in the end, then maybe that is the external pressure that we really need to adjust a little bit faster. So, yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation and the responses. And hopefully, if it is okay with you, we would be able to maybe publish on the website your presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Then we will arrange for that. Thank you. And I will now continue in Latvian. Thank you so much. Tātad turpinu arī latviski. Liels paldies! Es ceru, ka arī dzirdējāt visu, kas jūs interesēja šajā tēmā. Un tagad turpināsim arī latviski, un vairs pie angļu valodas šodien neatgriezīsimies. Varbūt tikai kaut kādos apkopojumos un jau prezentāciju publikācijā. Bet vēl gribēju īsi noprezentēt, esam pavisam nedaudz aizkavējušies, bet vēl gribu noprezentēt pavisam tādu vietēju skatu un arī skatu uz visiem šiem jau pārunātajiem ESPON datiem. ESPON dati telpiskie un arī statistiskie nav pieejami tikai šādā te formātā, kur mēs semināros klausamies, apskatām kartes. Pastāv iespēja arī šādus te datus izmantot arī jūsu ikdienas darbā. Tūlīt atkal dalīšos ar ekrānu. Tā. Izskatās, ka šis būs īstais. Sākšu ar šo. Tātad visi ESPON dati, arī par kuriem jau šodien dzirdējāt, lielākā daļa, vismaz cik es zinu, par robiem nezinu, bet ir pieejama šajā te portālā. Noteikti saites pievienošu arī apkopojumam, lai nav jāpatur tagad atmiņā no galvas, bet šis ir ESPON portāls, kurā ir apkopot visi, tā ir pilnīga datubāze visiem ESPON datiem. Un šeit jūs varat redzēt visus datus sadalītus gan tematiski, šeit būtu tad redzama tā tematiskā puse, un tad ir arī sadaļa, kas apskata pašus jaunākos un aktuālākos datus, kur varbūt ir kaut kas interesants, kas ir pavisam svaigs. Skatoties uz šiem te, pieņemsim, ieiesim ekonomikā, šeit var redzēt arī uzreiz granularitāti, cik tālu dziļumā mēs varam iet un cik detalizēti mēs varam redzēt, kā arī gadus. Uz šiem te datiem noteikti iesaku skatīties arī ar tādu aci, ka varbūt kaut kas noder tiešām iedvesmai. ESPON datu plus vienmēr ir tas, ka ESPON projektu ietvaros tiek ļoti detalizēti un padziļināti aprakstītas arī datu ievākšanas, strukturēšanas metodes. Līdz ar to, ja jūs ieraugat kādu tēmu, kas tiešām jums var palīdzēt, tad iespējams, ka līdzīgi kā darbojoties ar QGSP veidoto instrumentu, tas ir jūsu pašu izvēle, kādus jēlos datus jūs pielietojat, bet tā metode jau ir izstrādāta un jau ir pierādīta, kā laba esam. Un tad šādā gadījumā apskatot šos te rezultātus, noteikti varat arī paskatīties, kas tas ir par gadu, bet no tā viena dēļ nevajadzētu atmest interesantus datus, tos var izmantot iedvesmai. Un, protams, te ir pieejama arī dokumentācija un iespējams arī meklēt uzreiz meklētājā vienkārši tēmu, kas jūs interesē, nav jārakņājās par šīm te tematiskajām norādēm. Bet katrā ziņā šis te portāls ir sasaistīts arī ar ESPON mājaslapu, kuras saite jums ir arī programmā, bet vēlreiz pievienošu arī apkopojumā. Un šo te sasaisti es tiešām iesaku lietot, ja jūs ieraugat ESPON projektu, kas jums ir bijis interesants, arī apskatīties ar to saistītos dokumentus. Šodien tāda gadījuma nebija ar ESPON projektiem, bet pārsvarā ESPON projektos vienmēr ir vērts paskatīties, kādi ir bijuši tie izpētes gadījumi, jo daudzos ESPON pētījumos arī Latvijas pārstāvji ir bijuši iesaistīti ne tikai kā izpildītāji, bet arī kā ieinteresētās puses. Un tad var gadīties, ka jūs jau atrodat kaut kādus gatavus datus jau par Latviju, varbūt arī detalizētākā līmenī. Tas, ko es gribu uzsvērt, ka ESPON vienmēr skatās principā uz kaut kā pielietojamību un noderīgumu Eiropas līmenī. Līdz ar to arī lielākā daļa datu un pētījumu attiecās vairāk uz tādu plašāku skatu, var sakot, vai nu uz valstu salīdzinājumu, vai nu uz reģionu salīdzinājumu. Mūsu gadījumā, kā mēs esam valstī, tas, protams, nozīmē to, ka mēs varam salīdzināt, piemēram, Latgali ar Kurzemi, bet varbūt konkrēti Daugavpili ar Liepāju, teiksim, nē. Bet ir daži projekti, kuros tā detalizācija arī noteikti ir augstāka, un tiešām, ja kaut kas ir interesanti, to var pielietot arī savā, jau lokalizētākā līmenī. Tas par Eiropas Savienības līmeņa datiem, un, protams, ir arī datu bāzes, ko mēs jau pazīstam. Citas tām es šodien nepieskaršos, jo tās noteikti jūs jau zinat. Ja nezinat, būs iespējams apskatīties arī apkopojumā, bet gribēju arī pastāstīt par mūsu diviem tādiem, teiksim tā, instrumentiem, kas ļauj datus labāk vizualizēt un apgūt un arī izmantot plānošanas procesos. Viens no tādiem jau gataviem rezultātiem, teiksim tā, ar ko mēs ļoti varam ietvaros lepojamies, es teiktu arī, jau mēs tā publiski lepojamies visas Latvijas līmenī, ir mūsu Latvijas ainavu atlants, kurā ir apkopots ļoti, ļoti daudz zinātniski pamatotas informācijas par Latvijas ainavu izpēti, kartēšanu un novērtēšanu. Un šeit ir redzams vairākas sadaļas. Viens, protams, ir jaunumi, tur jūs varat atrast mūsu jaunumus par aktualitātēm Latvijas ainavu politikā, pārvaldībā un tā tālāk, bet gribu uzsvērt arī tādu faktu, kā iepazīstīja ainavas sadaļu. Ainavas noteikti ir tāda koncepcija, ko ir varbūt ikdienā grūti iedomāties kā kaut ko citu, ne tikai gleznu vai bildi Instagramā vai kaut ko tam līdzīgu, bet šeit ir arī dziļāk paskaidrots par ainavas definīciju un tādu plašāku uztveri par to un izpratni, kā arī dažādiem ietekmējošiem faktoriem, kā ainavas ir saistīts ar ekoloģiju un kas ir mūsu tās Latvijas identitāti veidojošās kanoniskās ainavas, ainavu dārgumi. Šī ir tāda kvalitatīva informācija, ko šeit varat atrast. Piemēram, šeit var ieiet iekšā un šeit pārsvarā visa informācija ir tekstveidā, un tur varat arī ar to ērti iepazīties. Un nākamā sadaļa, ko gribu izcelt, ir ainavas kartēs. Šeit jau tad arī šodien daudzas kartes redzējām, un šeit tad jau informācija ir noformēta nedaudz citādāk. Šeit var arī paspēlēties ar ainavu izpēti jau tādā telpiskā līmenī. Šeit varat arī paspēlēties, noteikti saite būs pievienota apkopojumā, un varēsiet arī paklikšķināt cauri. Es tālāk tur nemēģināšu izpētīt pilnīgi visu, bet šeit jūs varēsiet redzēt rezultātus no valsts pētījuma programmas pētījuma par ainavām, un te var redzēt arī ir 4 tādas sadaļas, kur mēs varam apskatīties visu ainavas tipoloģiju, kas mums Latvijā ir, un attiecīgi arī apskatīties. Vēl viena ļoti jauka lieta, kas šajā te digitālajā rīkā ir pieejama, ir ainavu stāsti, un šeit mēs gribam uzsvērt to, ka ainavas, kā jau mēs zinām, ir svarīgi ne tikai kā kaut kas, ko mēs nokartējam, ko arī uzsver pētnieki, ka ainavu robežas nevajag uztvert kā mietiņu, kas iespraust zemē kaut kur ļoti konkrētā vietā. Tās teritorijas ir nedaudz izplūdušākas, un viņas ir savā veidā, nevis savā veidā, bet savā būtībā saistītas, viņas ir neatraujamas. Un līdz ar to arī ir svarīgi, ka šajā digitālajā rīkā jūs varat rast to kopējo iespaidu par Latvijas ainavu kā tādu konceptu, izpratni un sajūtām. Un šeit ir sadaļas, piemēram, Latvijas ainavas fotogrāfijās, kur ir arī redzams dažādas fotogrāfijas no Latvijas dažādām vietām, ko arī ir uzņēmuši vairāk iedzīvotāji. Tas nav tikai pētnieku darbs uztvert ainavu. Šeit noteikti varat to papētīt, bet vēl svarīgi ir arī, piemēram, Latvijas ainavas senajos zīmējumos, kur var redzēt, kā, kura vieta ir izskatījusies senākos laikos. Šeit arī varam uzsvērt, ka tas, protams, ir tāds aptuvens atskats pagātnē, jo tā nav fotogrāfija, tie ir zīmējumi, un tur, kur ir mākslinieka iztēle gājusi, to mēs vairs nezinām. Bet katrā ziņā ļoti svarīga vēstures liecība un noteikti var mums parādīt, kas ir tas svarīgais, ko mums vajadzētu saglabāt. Un tālāk jau ir ainavu pārvaldība. Šajā sadaļā, kaut kas nenotika. Šeit tad ir redzams gan sadaļas par ainavu politiku, gan ieteikumu tieši speciālistiem, ko es arī tad varētu uzsvērt šodien. Šeit ir vairāki resursi jau pieejami, bet to arī attīstīsim. Un tas noteikti ir svarīgs visiem, kas šodien ir atnākuši skatīties uz datiem un instrumentiem, kas pieejami plānotājiem. Visvairāk gribu uzsvērt tiešām ainavas kartēs un šos te materiālus, kas ir domāti tieši speciālistiem. Jo šis ir bijis ļoti liels projekts. un tajā ir neaptverams lielums, daudzums informācijas, kuru mums arī bieži jautā, vai mēs grasamies tulkot. Atbilde ir, mēs gribētu, bet tas ir ļoti, ļoti daudz. Bet katram gadījumam, ja nu jūs interesē šīs instruments, pagājušajā piekdienā notika mūsu I Know Atlanta seminārs tieši pašvaldību plānotājiem. Man liekas, ka bija ne tikai pašvaldību plānotāji, bet arī reģionu pārstāvji. Un apkopojumā pievienošu arī saiti uz atskatu uz šo semināru, kur noteikti ir ļoti daudz vērtīgas informācijas, kas varētu jums noderēt. Tur stāstīja tieši arī paši I Know Atlanta veidotāji, un arī atbildējām uz dažiem jautājumiem, ko ar Atlantu var izdarīt un ko varbūt nevar izdarīt, kā tas var noderēt. Un viena ļoti laba lieta, ko mēs tā kā izrunājām, kas mums nostājās pa plauktiņiem, ir, ka I Know Atlantu nekad nevarēs izmantot kā vienu vienīgo pierādījumu kaut kam vai pierādījumu pret kaut ko, kas ir saglabājams vai kas ir likvidējams. Tas ir vienkārši analīzes atbalsta instruments. Un šajā te apkopojumā tad arī redzēsiet vairāk detaļas par to. Tā. Tas būtu par ainavām, un vēl, tā es te gribu aiziet uz pareizo, un vēl nenobīstaties no šīs mazliet haotiskās bildes, bet vēl mēs varam strādājam pie jūras un piekrastes datu rīka. Tas, ko redzat šeit, tas nav jūras un piekrastes datu rīks, tas ir pagaidām tikai mūsu koncepcija par to, kā to attīstīt. Nedaudz gribu par to pastāstīt, tāpēc, ka šīs seminārs mums ir lieliska iespēja tiešām arī uzjundīt jūsu interesi par šādu te rīku un varbūt arī piesaistīt tiešām kā nākotnes lietotājs šim rīkam. Kā jau dienas pirmajā daļā dzirdējāt, mums ir veikts ļoti, teiksim tā, apjomīgs novērtējums par piekrastes apmeklētājiem, par veģetāciju un infrastruktūras kvalitāti. Un visi šie ļoti vērtīgie dati, kas mums ir uzkrāti jau 3 šādos novērtējumos 10 gadu garumā, tad mēs ļoti gribam ar tiem dalīties un mēs gribam, lai tie tiktu izmantoti arī ikdienā. Ne tikai plānošanas reģionos veicot kaut kādas plānošanas aktivitātes un veidojot dokumentus, bet arī pašvaldībās. Un mēs zinām, ka ne visiem varbūt ir iespēja uzreiz ķerties vērsim pie ragiem, uzrakstīt mums e-pastu, dabūt datus un pašiem ar tiem strādāt, bet varbūt ir vēlme tos papētīt tādā mazliet sagremojamākā formātā, un līdz ar to izdomājām, ka mēs vēlamies šādu te rīku izstrādāt, lai dotu piekļuvi šiem te ļoti vērtīgajiem un detalizētajiem datiem, un ne tikai šiem, arī citiem, ne tikai plānotājiem, bet arī iedzīvotājiem. Var sakot, šis būs instruments, kā redzat šeit. Esam izveidojuši 2 tādas instrumenta puses. Viena būtu domāta tieši iedzīvotājiem, dažādu veidu interesantiem, varbūt kas nav piekrastes vai pat plānošanas eksperti, un tad otra puse būtu tiešām ekspertiem, kas ar datiem vai ar plānošanu vai tieši ar jūru un piekrasti darbojās teju katru dienu. Esam jau nokartējuši visas vajadzīgās funkcijas, protams, bez balss neviens nepaliek, tiklīdz kā mums būs pirmie rīka prototipi, varēsim arī konsultēties ar jums par to, kā to tālāk attīstīt, bet pagaidām tikai neliels ieskats, ka vēlamies tiešām dot piekļuvi datiem vienkāršāku jau tos sākotnēji vizualizēt, lai zinat, ar ko darbosieties, un lai zinat, kā varētu varbūt nākotnē labāk arī virzīt plānošanas procesus, rēķinoties ar piekrastes procesiem. Un šo mēs gribam izcelt atsevišķi, neskatoties uz to, ka mums jau ir Geolatvija, protams, un ir daudz vēl dažādi rīki, ir arī atvērto datu portāls, kurā var visu kaut ko ielikt iekšā. Mums šķita svarīgi tiešām skatīties uz jūru un piekrasti kā 2 nesaraujamām daļām, vienas monētas 2 pusēm, teiksim tā, un šie te procesi, kas norit piekrastē, ir ļoti sarežģīti, un mūsuprāt, ir ļoti svarīgi izcelt tieši tos materiālus, kas varētu palīdzēt to izprast labāk, un nepaļauties uz to, ka Katrs plānotājs ir plānošanas eksperts, līdz ar to arī jūras un piekrastes plānošanas eksperts. Tas ir iekļauj nedaudz citus procesus, tāpēc arī šāds uzsvers. Tātad par digitālajiem instrumentiem Latvijā no manas puses varbūt viss. Varbūt ir kādi jautājumi, pirms es virzos tālāk. Varbūt ir kādi komentāri, piemēram, no kolēģis Anetes Bērziņas, kas arī darbojās ar jūras un piekrastes plānošanas rīku, vai arī no Martas, kas arī varbūt šeit ir, bet nezinu, vai ir.
Papildinot Anetu, es varu teikt, jā, ka šobrīd tie dati, kas mums ir no piekrastes novērtējumiem, ir vizualizēti un publiski pieejami, es teikšu, ne tajos interaktīvākajos formātos, jo, protams, ka prasības paredz, ka mums ir jādod publiska informācija, bet, manuprāt, mums ir jāiet uz to, ka mēs informāciju publicējam un prezentējam jēgpilnā veidā, un lai jums tas ir lietojams plānotājiem un pašvaldību un institūciju darbiniekiem. Un tas, kas mūsuprāt ir ļoti svarīgi, ka mēs gribētu jums piedāvāt dažādus veidus, kā jūs tos datus varat savā starpā salīdzināt. Līdz ar to jūs varēsiet teritoriālās administratīvās vienībās salīdzināt, kā, kur, kas ir mainījies. Cerams, ka mums tas arī izdosies. Un arī tas, ko mēs ar Martu kopā strādājot un Anitu, mēs esam nonākuši pie slēdziena, ka mēs no sākuma vēlamies piedāvāt tādus rīkus, kas šobrīd ir, teiksim tā, populārākie, pieprasītākie. Un tad jau redzēsim, kā attīstīsies vēl jautājumi saistībā ar piekrastes attīstības un jūras plānošanu, jo skaidrs ir tas, ka šobrīd ļoti aktuāls jautājums ir piekļuves vietu jūrai noteikšana. Līdz ar to šādu rīku saistībā ar piekļuves vietām jūrai mēs plānojam parādīt. Un mums arī tagad ļoti forša informācija par Ainavu Atlantu, un arī tur attiecīgi ir arvien jaunas un jaunas lietas, kuras būtu prezentējums. Tā kā tas tāds neliels, teiksim tā, tīzeris, kā filmām saka, ka mēs ceram, ka mēs jums tiešām iedosim jēgpilnu rīku, ko lietot ar laiku. Un lūdzu, lietojiet, un es pieļauju, ka tas arī, ko Anita teica, ir muļķīgi. Es teikšu, es arī īstenībā tā neforši domāt, ka visur ir visi speciālisti nopakojušies augstākā līmeņa IT, ģis un tādi speciālisti. Mums patiešām ir jācenšas tiekties uz to, lai visiem tā kā izdodās un pašvaldībās cilvēki strādā investīciju programmas, īsteno attīstības ieceres, ka jums tiešām tas arī tā kā noder jūsu darbā, jums ir šie dati, skaitļi un fakti. Kaut kā tā.
Liels paldies, Anete. Es redzu arī komentāru no Martas, ka tuvākā mēneša laikā tēmējam uz prototipu, ko tad arī varētu mēģināt testēt. Droši vien, ka ierobežotākā lokā. Tas droši vien nebūs tā pilnais atvērtais process, kur visiem piedalīties, bet redzēsim, kā mums ar to ies, jo tiešām ir svarīgi, ka cik rīkus mēs varam izveidot. Protams, mēs varam sēdēt pie datora visu dienu, droši vien, ka nevaram, bet varam sēdēt pie datora te visu dienu un spēlēties ar to, kā dažādos veidos var atrisināt šo datu vizualizācijas jautājumu un publicēšanas jautājumu. Bet mēs tiešām to vēlamies izdarīt tādā ērtā veidā, lai arī ikdienā šie vairāki rīki, vairāki datu portāli un tā tālāk nekļūst par slogu. Var sakot, ka ir jāmeklē pa visiem kaktiem. Atceros, tur tai mazajai nišīgajai tēmai bija tur tas viens mazais portāliņš, tai citai savukārt cits. No mūsu puses, protams, visus rīkus, ko veidojam mēs, vienmēr var atrast vienā un tajā pašā mājaslapā, mūsu ministrijas mājaslapā, bet tad tas arī ir droši vien jautājums tāds, kas attiecās ļoti uz nākotni un kā tālāk jau valstī attīstīsies kopējās datu infrastruktūras, kā mēs varēsim to visu uzturēt, savienot, papildināt un uzlabot. Bet tad vēl semināra noslēgumā, tā kā neredzu citus jautājumus, ļoti mierīgi, ļoti jauki. Tā, protams, jautāt drīkst, lūdzu, ja ir vēl kādi jautājumi, to var darīt. Bet, ja jautājumu nav, es vēl, vai cik interesanti kaut kas te notika. Jūs redzat manu prezentāciju, kaut kā bišķi citādāk notika, viss nekā parasti. Nezinu, vai redz. Interesanti notika kaut kā. Ok, redz manu prezentāciju. Tā, pēdējā noslēguma informācija, redzējot cilvēki lēnām dodās piekdienā, bet viens mazs pēdējais solīts, ko es varētu palūgt, dot nelielas atsauksmes, un tur ir vieta arī papildus jautājumiem. Tur vajadzētu būt, ka tur ir divi logi, var sakot, viens, kur ir rakstīts augšā Q&A, un otrs, kur ir redzami jautājumi jau, uz kuriem var atbildēt. Tas tad būtu arī par šodien dzirdēto, tāda tehniskāka informācija, bet tiešām, ja vēlaties atstāt kādu brīvo komentāru, tur arī to var izdarīt, pievienojoties slido.com ar kodu ESPON.LV, vai arī noskanējot latviski sakot kvadrātu kodu. Tā laikam ir pareizi. Un tad vēl neliels drusciņš informācijas, kamēr varbūt kāds pieslēdzās šim, tad vēl ir pāris īsi teikumi no manas puses. Pēc tam nomainīšu slaidu atpakaļ uz iepriekšējo, bet vēlos pieteikt, ka 27. novembrī rīkojam arī klātienes ESPON semināru, kur, protams, būs pilnīgi citas tēmas, būs cits fokus, būs vairāk informācijas pieejams varam mājaslapā no 25. oktobra. Pagaidām programma veidojas tādā virzienā, ka mēs vēlamies apskatīt mūsu noturību pret dažādām krīzēm, ar pagaidām izskatās lielu fokusu uz tādām mūsu, teiksim tā, nevis perifērijām, bet uz mūsu apmalītēm. Ja katram mākonītim ir zelta maliņa, tad Latvijai ir tāda maliņa, uz kuru ir vērts paskatīties tuvāk. Tātad fokus ne tikai uz piekrasti, tur mazliet citā ievirzē, skatoties uz mūsu tematiskā plānojuma starpnovērtējumu ziņojumu un novērtējumu, un tad arī uz mūsu Krievijas pierobežas pusi, kur dažādas, teiksim tā, militārās krīzes saistītie efekti satiekās ar sociāliem aspektiem un sociālo kohēziju, teiksim tā, un kā mēs to varētu risināt. Un tad papildus vēlos pieteikt, ka ir iespēja pašvaldību, plānošanas reģionu un ministriju, kā arī nevalstisku organizāciju pārstāvjiem iespēja pieteikties mērķētajai analīzei. Mērķētā analīze ESPON programmas kontekstā tātad ir kaut kāda veida pētījums, kas varētu palīdzēt veidot konkrētu politiku. Šādus te pieteikumus var pieteikt jebkurš, kas pārstāv šo te, teiksim tā, publisko vai trešo sektoru. Un arī šeit prezentācijā un vēlāk arī apkopojumā tātad ir saite uz vairāk informāciju, un saistībā ar šo tad arī ESPON rīko tādu kā īsu darbsemināru 11. decembrī, kur būs iespējams gan uzdot jautājumus par pieteikumu rakstīšanu, gan arī dzirdēt vairāk par to, ar kādu mērķi šie te pieteikumi ir vēlams rakstāmi, un ko no šī procesa var dabūt priekš sevis ikdienai, darbam un tā tālāk. Un kā jau šodien runājām, varam pētīt daudz, ievākt daudz datus, uzlikt to visu uz kartes un ko tālāk. Un šis tad ir tas procesa posms, kur mēs sākumā izdomājam, ko tālāk, un tad gādājam datus. Tā kā ļoti vērtīgs process, ja vēlaties vairāk informācijas par to, noteikti ieiet šajās saitēs, vai arī varu piedāvāt sazināties ar mani. Tātad šeit mans telefona numurs, e-pasts arī varbūt neatbild uzreiz vai tajā pašā dienā vai nākamajā, bet noteikti atbildēšu. Un, jā, ja vēl kādam ir kādi jautājumi, droši varat tos uzdot, bet visādi citādi. Liels jums paldies šodien par dalību un uz tikšanos jau citu reizi.